If you hadn't already heard, gardening is destroying the planet, and if you grow your own food, then you're pretty much as responsible as Exxon, Shell, BP, and all the other enormous polluters, because you are producing enormous amounts of carbon that you just simply don't need to, because you should just leave it to farmers to grow the food for you. Yeah, I might have exaggerated a little bit, but this is the article that's come out from the Telegraph, which is suggesting that food that you grow at home is 5 times higher in carbon emissions than food that you buy from the supermarket or just produced commercially. And then I went and read the scientific paper that it was based on. I made a few notes, so I'm going to go through them with you now. Because most of the article was shared as a picture of the headline and then the first few lines of it, people weren't able to read it because it's behind a paywall. So this is the statement that I've been asked to read out by my fictitious lawyer, because I don't have any money, so if there are any lawyers after me, then it's a real waste of time, because you won't get anything out of me, because there's nothing to get. So in order to read it, what you definitely should not do is go to https://archive.is. The link is certainly not in the description, and definitely do not paste the URL that the Telegraph article is from into the section at the top of the page and press this button, because that will show you a picture of the archived article for free. And you definitely shouldn't do that, because the billionaire owners, the Barclay family of the Telegraph, definitely deserve every single penny that they get. And that would be, yeah, it's equivalent to stealing from an incredibly moral person. So just don't get the article that way. They're trying to give you the message that gardening and growing your own food is somehow completely inefficient and there's no point in doing it because you're just going to be damaging the environment. And they've done that based on the fact that the study that was published in Nature Cities, which is a publication primarily targeted at city planners, and I'll come back to why that's relevant in a minute, but it suggests that growing your own food at home is too carbon intensive and it should be left to the professionals. However, it does say that carbon-intensive crops like tomatoes and asparagus, which often have to travel a long way, it does suggest that if you grow those, then it's still better to be growing them in your back garden. And so for tomatoes, they're grown in greenhouses that are often heated, so obviously that uses a lot of energy. And then the asparagus has to travel a long way to get to you, so that uses a lot of fuel. So it's suggesting that you should just focus on those and not bother with anything else, because it's more efficient to have it grown on a farm. If you go to the actual study, it was written by Jake Hawes, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. Now, that's relevant because often PhD candidates have to come up with some fairly experimental studies that approach things in a new way, and they have to do them really, really quickly, because they're not going to get the same level of funding that, for instance, an experienced professor might be able to get. So let's not go all in on the scientist, because I think that the problem here is not the science and the institutions that are pushing that forward, it's the way that it's reported in the popular media. And in the paper, what you can actually get from it is that it's highlighting the carbon intensive parts of growing your own food. And it makes the distinction between urban agriculture and traditional agriculture on larger farms. And the urban agriculture can take the shape of a community garden, allotments in the UK, but the carbon from the smaller scale urban agriculture, which is how the study refers to it, rather than homegrown, which is what the Telegraph article changes it to, is from the infrastructure that's used to grow the food. So the infrastructure that's required, that could include pathways when you're installing the new irrigation, when you're putting up sheds, fences, raised beds. So getting new products to make those things is carbon intensive compared to if you're growing things in a large field, So if you were going to take the one takeaway message from the paper, it would be that they wanted people to notice that that was where most of the carbon was coming from that was being emitted as a result of their gardening, and then figure out ways that they could acquire those materials either as recycled or reused from elsewhere. And once they've done that, then it is completely equivalent to growing it in commercial agriculture. And the relevance of that to the fact that it was published in Nature Cities is that one of the things that they talk about in the paper is the fact that in construction, the recycling rates for most materials are absolutely terrible. And if you're involved in urban planning or you're involved in local government that can affect, say, the recycling of an area, then you might be able to put aside some of the materials that are being put into landfill from construction and allocating them for urban agriculture. And at that point, you as the city will have reduced the carbon emissions overall of the city, because the paper is reporting the fact that urban agriculture is increasing, and it's talking about all of the benefits of that urban agriculture. So in one of the sites in the UK, it suggests that 99.4% of the economic output of the site is not from the gardening products themselves, but from the reduced hospital emissions, because there will be lower rates of depression because the people are less lonely and they have something to do and a purpose and people that they can interact with, as well as the improvement in their diet. So it's then putting an economic value on the social benefits that you get from the garden. And then if you were to look at the fact that there are food deserts in lots of cities where people don't have access to fresh produce, their diets are going to improve dramatically, and the health outcomes of that are going to mean that there's a lot less cost on government. And the health and social benefits of gardening in urban areas is absolutely ignored by the Telegraph article. But in a way, that doesn't even matter either. And that's because most carbon emissions from diet are not from this at all. They're not from eating vegetables. They're from dairy and meat. And there's also other studies that suggest that as people get involved in growing their own food, their meat and dairy consumption goes down. So the fact that they reduce their most carbon intensive sections of their diet is likely that that completely makes up for the fact that they built a shed that they may have been using for something else as well anyway. And the second reason why it's completely pointless to discuss this is because one of the problems with the short-term nature of the infrastructure of these sites, which is specified by the paper, is the fact that they're fairly temporary. So in cities, often these sites get developed and therefore you lose the site and you have to find somewhere else to go and build another one. And the irony of this is, by having an urban agriculture project somewhere in a city, it increases its chance of gentrification. So by improving the area, by putting a garden in it, it increases the chance that the thing has to then be moved because they have lost the place that they needed to garden in, because they increased the land value of it, and then a developer came in and built a block of flats. So the temporary nature of these urban gardens that they're talking about is often the reason why you might then be skewing the data in such a way that means that the thing has to be rebuilt frequently, not for the fault of the people involved in the project, but for the fact that it produces so much in the way of social benefits, then the land is worth more. So is the problem here the garden, or is it something else? So while the study has some really useful outcomes that might be useful for people involved in city planning and urban development, the Telegraph article doesn't. And it seems to simplify urban agriculture to gardens and allotments, presumably so that it can make that identifiable with more of its Middle England readership. Although it might be useful to them and they might be interested in the outcomes of it, as far as saving the planet is concerned, is an absolute drop in the ocean. Because you go back to 2005, and that was allegedly when Ogilvy, popularising the idea of a personal carbon footprint to BP, because then they thought it might be helpful to prevent people from collectively bargaining to get governments and large organisations to stop polluting so much, because they were thinking it might feel a little bit hypocritical if somebody from Middle England who went on holiday to the United States were to then add up their annual carbon footprint and say, well, that flight, that contributed a great deal of environmental cost. So maybe I shouldn't be lobbying those organisations, because it might be hypocritical of me because I have contributed to that. Whereas realistically, that individual could make absolutely no difference whatsoever. Whereas BP and Shell and other huge organisations like Exxon, weapons manufacturers and governments would be able to make a difference. And so by breaking apart the collective bargaining, by making people examine themselves, they've effectively passed the responsibility back to the people who have the least say in making any difference. So just because you've occasionally, when it's been raining and you live within walking distance to where your kids go to school, and you drove them to school, or because once you left the lid on one of the bottles that you put into your recycling that you ordinarily meticulously organise, and then you realise you may have contaminated a whole batch of plastic recycling, you might be able to alleviate that guilt by realising that you are probably not the main problem in this system that is destroying the planet, because you as an individual really can't make any difference until you start collectively bargaining. And lots of the people who are involved in those collective bargaining processes are probably involved in urban agriculture too, just from my experience of getting involved with it. So if you hadn't cottoned on, just to make it absolutely clear, I think that the article from the Telegraph was absolute trash. The paper had some utility for people who are involved in city planning and local government. And I'm sure that if you're already interested in gardening and growing your own food, this isn't going to make any difference to you. I would be absolutely shocked and frankly appalled if somebody stopped gardening because of seeing this. But my fear is that people who haven't already got involved in growing their own food might be put off by that loudmouth, brutish, boorish character who has an overly inflated size of their value of their own opinions, might be citing this article, suggesting that gardening is somehow destroying the planet. And that might be enough for somebody who was just researching into gardening to just not bother. It might deflate them a little bit. The message that I would give to them is that isn't what the science says whatsoever. And this is a fairly experimental article that is intended probably to help get this person who's published it a PhD. So no, the study is not some conspiracy, and the sensational article is just there to try and sell newspapers. So just, if you're interested in gardening, do not be put off by it and start growing some food, because there are so many benefits associated with it for your health, your diet, and the fact that it's a way of connecting with other people and alleviating this massive issue that we have at the moment where lots of people are lonely because they don't see anybody outside of their family and work. And it's never too late to start. Just start doing it, make the mistakes that you need to make, and plant a few seeds. If you are looking for a way of starting, then I'd suggest that urban agriculture projects are a great way to get involved, because realistically gardening is something that's quite practical, and it is a massive benefit to get some hands-on tuition from somebody who already knows what they're doing, and they can cut out a lot of the mistakes that you'll end up making if you only try and do it from YouTube videos and books. So please, please, please reach out to somebody, start gardening if it's something that you're interested in doing, and just flatly ignore this absolute bullshit.